So in this documentary we're going to be looking at the future of the Swedish nation for the next 40 years or so in terms of demographics and the changes that will happen. And hopefully it's clear from part 1 that you can see up here that the only way for an individual to authentically belong to a group is to have the majority of things in common with that group. And if we look at the type of immigration that has occurred into Sweden leading up to the 20th century, this has largely been from Sweden's close neighbors, Germany, Norway, Denmark and Finland. In the milk analogy, these neighboring nations would be best represented by the ingredient heavy cream and butter that seamlessly and effortlessly mixes in homogeneously. On the other hand, if 2 or more nations share a country, don't have enough in common and just spend some time in the same geographical area, not only does that not result in belonging, but it also creates parallel nations or parallel societies within the same country. An analogy that works well is the milk bottle that shows that just because different ingredients share the same package doesn't make them milk. As a side note, it should be mentioned that parallel nations living within the same country often have resulted in violence and civil war. Some examples are Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Syria, Sri Lanka, the Balkan Wars, Israel-Palestine, or the India-Pakistan partition. And as this Twitter post points out, the result of mass migration without any requirements for assimilation is a nation with massive cells of folks with foreign allegiance. And Elon Musk correctly answers here, it lays the groundwork for civil strife if not war. But if we naively assume that long-term peace will last for a few decades or even a century between these 2 or more parallel nations in the same country, one of those nations may or may not get replaced depending on how dominant each nation is living within the same country and how strong each nation's ability is to resist getting their culture overwritten. This is essentially the experiment that was started in Sweden in 1990. Without any public referendum, I should say, and the experiment is still currently ongoing today. As of 2015, based on the Swedish police own report of the situation in Sweden, there were 53 no-go zones, or as they like to refer to them, vulnerable areas. By 2017, this trend had worsened with 61 no-go zones. You can see some of these areas in the police report here. The police define no-go zones in their report as having 4 main attributes in common. 1. Residents there are unwilling to participate in the legal process. 2. The police are unable to carry out their duties in the area because they regularly get attacked when they enter. 3. Extremism is prevalent, primarily violent Islamist extremism according to the report. 4. Parallel social structures exist. Parallel social structures is just a fancy way of saying parallel nations living within the same country that we mentioned earlier. Like for example, Little Mogadishu, formerly known as Rinkeby. Parallel nations living within the same country is also what would explain why it looked like this in Stockholm on Sweden's National Day, 6th of June. It's also why, when students are graduating high school in Sweden nowadays, it looks like this. Parallel societies can also explain why you have taxi cars like this in Sweden that says Assyria on the license plate. And it's why you hear statements like this.
Vilka flaggor ni har?
We do motherfucking Kurdistan, fuck Sweden.
Long live Kurdistan, fuck Sweden. So not only is Sweden getting taken advantage of, but it's also getting spat in the face.
Free Palestina!
Jag bara undrar varför ni tar den svenska flaggan.
Är du rasist eller?
Nej, jag bara undrar.
Varför vill du vara med?
Varför ni tar en svensk flagga?
Men varför ska vi ha svensk flagga för?
Indeed, why should you have a Swedish flag, or a Swedish paid education, or a Swedish citizenship for that matter? Nation eradicating racist leftists like Ingrid Lomfors from part 1 will of course argue that immigration into Sweden is nothing new, that the nation has always changed throughout history, and so what's happening today is natural. Like all great lies, this statement has a seed of truth in it that's then greatly misrepresented and exaggerated. It's true that the nation is dynamic and that it has the potential to change a little bit every day, but that's where the truth ends. The first lie by omission is to not mention that the immigration that has occurred into Sweden throughout history has been from neighboring and culturally similar nations that already had a lot in common with the Swedish group. There were no airplanes or long-distance boats even to take people from halfway across the world and inject them straight into the veins of a completely different society within a day. The second line there is that the nation has to change whether the people want it to or not, that they have no choice. This is also false. Many times in history, a nation's people have been able to reject foreign influences if they disagree with it. Otherwise, the Jews, for example, wouldn't exist today because they wouldn't have been able to reject the influence of the nations they were living within before Israel existed. The third line there is the numbers. Leftists today often mention the Walloons that immigrated into Sweden in the 17th century to make their case. But the reality is that this was an extremely small group, only 0.2% of Sweden's total population at the time, so 2,000 people out of 900,000. Today, over 2 million citizens of Sweden were not born in Sweden. That's more than 20% of the population being foreign-born immigrants. And if you add those born in Sweden with 2 foreign-born parents, also known as second generation, then it becomes 726,000 more, giving us a total of 28% of the citizens of Sweden that has a foreign background. Compared to the Walloons, that's a 1,000 times more in the amount of immigrants, and that's a 100 times more in proportion to the population. Not to mention that the Walloons had more in common with the 17th century Swedes than the modern asylum seeker immigrants have in common with today's Swedes in terms of culture, religion, education, and ethnicity. And we should note that the 28% figure does not include Swedish citizens with 1 foreign-born parent. If those individuals are included, they add another 849,000 people, bringing the total to 35.7% of the population having a foreign background, or about 3,786,000 people. So to answer the leftists from earlier, I think it's safe to say that this is not natural, it's definitely not always been happening, and it's definitely a radically new chapter in Sweden's history. We also must not forget that the demographics of the nation groups living together in the same country matters a lot long term. For example, Somali women living within Sweden have double the amount of children than that of native Swedish women. With each generation replaced, that becomes an exponential increase in difference. And we have to remember that the native Swedish fertility rate isn't even at the replacement rate of 2.1. It's actually been around 1.4 since 2022. This is an important piece of information because it means that the native Swedish population will not even stay the same size, but rather decrease by every generation that passes. This is why a Finnish researcher, Kyösti Tarvainen, made a projection suggesting that if current immigration and demographic trends continue, ethnic Swedes could become a minority in Sweden around 2065. So when this Somali woman on TikTok is saying that in a few years Norwegians will be a minority group in their own country and that she's looking forward to see 1,000 of Abdis instead of Anders, she's not wrong in terms of numbers. Another example of today's parallel nations is in Germany, where German citizens with Turkish ethnicity cheered for Turkey when it played against Germany in the soccer game at UEFA Euro 2024. When the Turkish brothers Erkan and Talha Aykan were asked who they would be supporting in Euro 2024, they said in unison, quote, "Only Turkey. We live here, we're born here, but our hearts are in Turkey." As we see with these Turks in Germany, although it increases the chances, belonging doesn't even necessarily happen after learning the local language or even after becoming a citizen. This becomes increasingly true the lower the requirements are to get the citizenship of the nation group. In fact, belonging doesn't even necessarily happen after passing a civics test, a language test, or a history test. This is why I say that if you're not gonna be an ethno-nationalist, you have to introduce some cost to the belonging and to the citizenship, like doing military service, for example. Otherwise, you just incentivize getting the citizenship for free money and free resources. Citizenships in Sweden, for example, have for decades now been given out like advertisement flyers or free pens at the bank. The citizenships were mainly given to Middle East and African adult men, who claimed to be 1. Asylum seekers and 2. Children. Regarding point 1 about being asylum seekers, it turned out that according to a 2022 study by the company Novus, 79% of refugees reported visiting their home country that they allegedly fled from at least once since arriving to Sweden. This is not an isolated finding, by the way. Other studies in Norway confirm these results. Also, 2, about being children. In Norway, dental age testing for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children found that approximately 70% were determined to be 18 years or older. And most importantly, Sweden gave out citizenships to people who never had a will to get more in common with the Swedish group or belong to it in the first place. They were happy with their own nation group's identity and generally didn't come because they loved Sweden so much. What would incentivize them to come then? For a better life, of course, with free money, free healthcare, free education, as anyone would have done if they were offered free money and a better life without any demands or strings attached. As a rhetorical question, one could ask, if Somalia were to strike oil tomorrow and become the next Dubai, with every citizen becoming a millionaire, how many of them do you think would stay in Sweden because they love the Swedish nation and its culture so much? Let's see what this woman has to say.
Jag hör inte hemma här. Har jag sagt till dig att jag hör hemma här? Det är därför jag förstör och stör så mycket jag kan. Och utnyttjar era skattepengar. På alla förmåner som man kan ha här som svensk medborgare. Jag utnyttjar det till max. Till max utnyttjar jag det. Och ni kan inte ens göra någonting åt det.
Not only was it naive for the Swedes to assume that every immigrant that comes to Sweden wants to be Swedish, but also racist, because it assumes that the Swedish nation group is somehow preferable or superior to the immigrant nation group. The most important thing of this whole documentary that we have to remember is that the prerequisite to be able to gain belonging to a new group is the individual's will to change himself and leave behind what he once was. How else could you get more in common with the new nation group? This theme is explored in Avatar, where, remember, Jake Sully promises that he's ready to learn new ways. My cup is empty, he says, before the Omotikaya clan agrees to take him in and spend resources on him, teaching them their ways.
Why did you come to us?
Came to learn.
We have tried to teach other sky people. It is hard to fill a cup which is already full.
My cup is empty.
You have to empty your cup before you can fill it. You cannot have 2 drinks in the same cup because they're competing for the same space. Either you cheer for Germany or you cheer for Turkey. Either you shake a woman's hand when offered or you do not, like in Islam. Without that will to change yourself, the conversation topic quickly changes into something more like an invasion or occupation of another nation group's country and resources. For the immigrants who actually want to assimilate, change themselves and leave behind what they once were in order to have more in common with the host nation group, no requirements to get citizenship might seem like a nice thing to do to help them, but it's actually doing them a huge disservice, because now they'll never know if and at what point they truly have earned their belonging. It's like giving out medals to kids who didn't win a sports competition. It seems nice, but you're actually robbing them of the future joy of when they won and actually earned it. Like some type of pathological short-term empathy. So back to the question. How can an immigrant like David or the 2 Turkish brothers Erka and Talha Aykan know when they have enough in common with the host nation group to be considered to belong to it. Ideally, by passing a well-designed citizenship test. If the citizenship test is designed to be realistic and comprehensive enough to match the real nation group's threshold, then that would be a very good indicator or a marker if you've earned your belonging to the nation group or if you're incompatible with it. It would save everyone involved a lot of time, money, and effort, not least the individual himself, but also the host nation, of course. Again, just like in Avatar, the citizenship test would include several components or criteria to be tested based on what the nation group has in common with each other. The reason the Omotikaya clan tested riding a horse, killing an animal, and bonding with the dragon is because those things were central to their way of life. In the same way, a citizenship test for being a Swede should test the things that are central to the Swedish way of life. One criteria would obviously be aimed at testing if the immigrant has a native level language proficiency. This goes without saying. Another basic criteria would be knowledge of the nation's civics and history. Confirming if basic Swedish values are shared, like humility and sustainability, should also be another part of the test. Suffice it to say, the immigrant would have to apply himself to train and study hard to pass the test. That's the whole point, just like Jake Sully had to train in the Omotikaya clan's way to become more like them before he could attempt their tests to confirm if he learned enough. Test of riding a horse, the test of a clean and respectful kill in a hunt, and the test of surviving a fight with the dragon and bonding with it. The purpose of the citizenship test is to show if the individual has enough in common with the group or not. If the immigrant does not have enough in common, he should fail the citizenship test and rightfully be excluded. It should be said that this is not something new. The US has had their naturalization test for over 100 years, and Denmark, Sweden's neighbor, has had their citizenship test for over 20 years. The citizenship test and its different components should together answer the question, who are we? Naturally then, the Swedish citizenship test would have to be designed by somebody who is in touch with the nation and who knows about its history and ancestry. Needless to say, a young person raised in the 1990s confused and divided Sweden is unlikely to be a good designer of the Swedish citizenship test. Finally, after passing all of the components of the citizenship test, it should be completed with 1. Swearing an oath of loyalty to the new nation, 2. By a mandatory enlistment and placement into the nation's civil defense or military unit, depending on the IQ, personality, and other skills of the individual in question. 3. By being given a Swedish name, just like in Judaism, where a convert is formally given a Hebrew name at the time of conversion. And this isn't optional in the religious sense, it becomes your official Jewish name. This proper citizenship test would even out unfairness, and as a result, clear out most xenophobia very fast. And more importantly, passing the citizenship test would give the hardworking immigrant the credit and the recognition that they deserve for their hard work, but that they are not getting in today's Sweden, where everybody gets a medal. If a proper citizenship test is missing or completely absent, like in today's Sweden, where there isn't even a basic kindergarten level language test, then it becomes much more difficult for the immigrants to know when they've had enough in common with the host nation group to actually belong. And just like parents gets confused who actually won in a kid's soccer tournament where everybody gets a medal, it also becomes much more difficult for the host nation group to know which of the immigrants authentically belong to the group. As you can see, giving out citizenships with its benefits to everybody sows a seed of hesitation, unease, suspicion, and distrust, as has happened in Sweden, and rightfully so. Literally anyone from the world could be walking on the streets of your neighborhood, since there were no requirements to get citizenship other than time spent in the country. Remember, in Sweden, the only requirement to get a citizenship is to have lived 4 years in Sweden. Of course, this distrust falsely gets labeled as racism and xenophobia by leftists. As we see today, a leftist can of course say that an immigrant belongs out of sympathy and even give him easy access to citizenship as a cope. But authentic belonging is not something that can be forced or achieved by some immigrants' welcome signs. The individual immigrant and the host nation group for that matter will feel themselves if the belonging is there or not, based on what they have in common. Just like kindergarten kids will feel who their true friends are even if the teacher tells them that everybody have to be friends with each other. There was a 2015 interview study showing the worthlessness of cheap words and virtue signaling. In the study, 19 new mothers were interviewed where in Sweden they wanted to live and raise their children, and they all expressed that they, quote, wanted to live in a mixed area, and that they wanted their children to grow up in an area that reflected today's Sweden that has become a multicultural society. The most common argument by the mothers was that the child could become enriched by meeting people from different cultures. In practice, however, all the mothers interviewed avoided mixed-race neighborhoods and schools, often citing the best interest of the child that should grow up in a, quote, calm and safe environment. At the same time, the Swedes are of course quick to say that you don't need to fulfill any criteria to belong to our nation group, or that there are no criteria in the first place. It's a striking hypocrisy, and we see this same type of pattern here in another study. The study shows us that when the proportion of non-European immigrants in a Swedish neighborhood rises to a so-called tipping point around 3 to 4%, ethnic Swedes start to move out of the area. It's pure hypocrisy. Look at their actions, not their politically correct statements. And another example is when Åsa Romson, a popular Swedish leftist politician, summarized her party's viewpoint when she said, quote,
För när jag går omkring här i Stockholm till vardags och möter de invånare som bor och lever här, så tycker jag nog att alla som åker på den tunnelbanan är svenskar.
And if we look at the 349 members of parliament in Sweden in 2013, we could see that 94% agree with her and pushed for more immigration into Sweden. Meanwhile, that year, less than 2% of those very same members of parliament lived in high immigrant areas. So you have 329 members of parliament pushing for more immigration, while 324 of those are avoiding living in high immigrant areas. That gives us a hypocrite rate of 98.5%.
Bad ideas have consequences, said the famous psychologist and author God Saad.
Bad ideas have consequences.
Sweden's bad idea that anybody can belong to the Swedish nation group despite not having anything in common with it has had bad consequences. And more importantly, the bad ideas will continue to have bad consequences far into the future. Foreign-born residents rose from 2% in the 1990s to about 20% or 2 million people by 2022. At the same time, Sweden has had a 500% increase in fatal shootings and a 1,194% increase in reported rapes from 1975. From 769 reported rapes in 1975 to 9,957 rapes by 2024. That's more than one reported rape for every hour, day and night around the year.
And yes, correlation unfortunately equals causation. Swedish men didn't wake up one day and decide to quadruple their number of rapes, but rather, during the period 2000 to 2020 in Sweden, foreign-born men born outside of Sweden were convicted of rape at a per capita rate approximately 4.3 times higher than that of Swedish men born in Sweden with 2 Swedish parents. These are figures publicly accessible from Lund University that you could verify yourself. And once again, similar results are also found in Sweden's neighboring countries. So here we have Denmark between 2008 and 2024, for example, where we can see that per capita, Nigerian men in Denmark rape 14 times more than Danish men in Denmark, and Somali men in Denmark rape 8 times more than Danish men. And this is age-adjusted numbers, looking at the males that are 15 to 34 years old. And again, this is publicly accessible data from Statistics Denmark that you can verify for yourself.
And in a study asking Swedish high school youth if they had been beaten up, 16% of atheists and Christians answered yes, while only 8.3% of Muslim youth answered yes. Meanwhile, when asked, have you been threatened by someone in such a way that you felt seriously afraid, Muslims again not only reported lower percentages compared to the other groups, but remarkably were the only group in Sweden that had decreased their percentage since 2013 instead of increased it like the other groups. Lastly, Sweden experienced a notable number of bomb explosions in 2024 and 2025, with almost 200 more bombings than any other country in Europe in 2025 alone, despite its smaller population. These type of statistics are coming from every part of society and just cannot be ignored anymore, no matter how inconvenient it is to the current narrative that anyone can become Swedish. The older Swedes tell stories about when they went on vacation in the 1970s and they used to leave their door open. That's how safe it used to be. And that doesn't exist any longer. Sweden's insistence on denying that there are criteria associated with being a Swede might be described best as endophobia or oikophobia, a tendency to criticize or reject one's own home or home society while praising others. With that explanation in mind, perhaps it's not entirely surprising how Sweden could allow mass immigration from nations that have polar opposite cultures to its own. When we look at the top 10 largest foreign-born groups in Sweden, we see nations like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. When we then look at the world cultural map, we can see that the mentioned nations are on the opposite side of the spectrum compared to Sweden. This takes us to an important question. Can you belong to two radically different nations at the same time? The answer is no, because life sometimes forces us to choose. We saw this most clearly in an interview in America, where Muslim youth with American citizenship were asked the question, if America were to get into a war with Iraq or another Muslim country, which country would you defend? The Muslim youth answered, we would support our Muslim brothers.
I have a question for you guys. If America were to get in a war with a country like Iraq, who would you guys defend, America or Iraq?
We would support our brothers in Iraq. That's the only way.
So you wouldn't defend America?
We would not defend America.
So that question is perhaps the best way to understand belonging, because it reveals the person's true loyalty. Another way to find out true belonging would be to ask, if your country was playing Sweden in the World Cup, who would you cheer for?
Diversity is a nice word, but diversity within a nation is a paradox and a contradiction. The true definition of diversity is diversity of nations in the world. That's what it used to mean. If you ask any family around the world, including your own, would you want to share a house with another family of different values? Everybody would say no. No one wants a world of milk cocktails where every country on earth looks the same with the same mix of people in it. Like, imagine if the national soccer teams in the World Cup would be the same diverse mixes in each of the nations. It would be a pointless exercise to watch that, and it would be dystopian. Just think of the Lord of the Rings and how boring it would be if all of the nation groups of the different kingdoms would be mixed into the same grey sludge cocktail. The story would be poorer. There would be no distinct elves, no distinct hobbits, no distinct humans or orcs to speak of. The Shire village, being an inland area settled exclusively by hobbits, would lose all of its character and uniqueness. Because the people make the place, and in the long term, the place makes the people. Imagine a world where you travel to Russia and see only Somalis and Indians and Arabs. You travel to Japan and see the same thing. You travel to Mexico and see the same thing. That would be dystopian, and that's the reality that we're heading closer to by every day that this insane politics continues. We all want a world with many different nation groups that have their own countries. That obviously doesn't mean that you can't travel and visit other countries as long as you respect the place that you come to. Any 5-year-old can understand this, that when you're in somebody else's home, you respect that family's rules instead of imposing your own ways. And just like caring for your family and wanting the best for it doesn't mean that you hate other families, caring for your nation's survival and wanting the best for it doesn't mean that you hate other nations. It's not a zero-sum game. In other words, there can be many winners. When Anakin turns evil in Star Wars, he says to Obi-Wan, "If you're not with me, then you're my enemy." To which Obi-Wan replies, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes."
To the Republic, to democracy! If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
For those who have been following Sweden's development for the last couple of decades and who care about it, it's obvious that the thing Sweden desperately needs, and that's 40 years overdue, is to have a country-wide citizenship test for all of those born after 1990. The year 1990 is pivotal, because that's when mass immigration really started to pick up speed in Sweden. Here's how it would work. First, a constitutional change would have to be made that allows the government to revoke citizenships and declare them invalid. 2. The government would make an announcement that all Swedish citizenships issued after January 1st, 1990 would need to be re-evaluated no later than within 3 years. 3. In order to obtain an approved re-evaluation, you would have to fulfill at least one of the following criteria. A. Submitted proof that at least one grandparent had Swedish ancestry before 1990. Or B. Completed citizenship tests, enlistment in the Swedish Armed Forces, sworn an oath of loyalty, and a clean criminal record from both the home country and within Sweden. 4. If an approved re-evaluation is not achieved within the 3-year deadline, that would mean that the citizenship becomes invalid, and a new personal number with a non-citizenship visa is issued. 5. A voluntary offer of re-emigration is issued, with offers to pay plane tickets, etc. As mentioned earlier, the result of all of this would be that a new category of citizenship would come into life. It would be called the non-citizenship visa. These non-citizen residents wouldn't have the responsibility that the citizens have, like military service for example. On the other hand, these non-citizen residents wouldn't have access to national benefits and resources, such as free healthcare, free education, and ability to vote, etc. Just like someone who doesn't belong to your family and wouldn't care to protect it shouldn't have access to live in your house or spend your life savings. The ultimate purpose of the citizenship test and re-evaluating citizenships given out after 1990 is to give the Swedes our home back, that we have progressively lost since 1990 to foreign nations. With that being said, it's unlikely to succeed, and the most probable scenario is that Swedes will become a minority in Sweden by about 2060. The Swedes will then have lost their only home and country by voluntarily giving it up to foreign nations. But that doesn't mean that they're dead. When that time comes, the best thing that the Swedes can do is to find and reignite their Swedish identity, to learn about Swedish history, to have children, to know who your ancestors were, what their and your traditions were, and thereby manage to unite and survive as a minority within foreign nations, just like the Jews, the Romani, and the Kurds have managed to do for centuries. The Swedes as a nation are not dead until we've lost our last reproducing community.